All right, I'm going to go ahead and start the webinar.
Good morning, everyone. This is Tiara speaking. Thank you for joining. We're going to give everyone a few moments just to log in. Good morning. This is Tiara. Thank you all for joining us today. We're going to give just a few more moments for everyone to join us. Still see people trickling in. All right, so good morning, everyone. I am so excited to welcome you to MBCR's virtual ADA commemoration. My name is Tiara Yakini, and I am with the Disability Rights and Compliance Division at the Michigan Department of Civil Rights. I am a dark-skinned African-American female with braided hair, and I'm wearing a lime green blazer and a white blouse. For full accessibility, it is critical that speakers first identify themselves by name before proceeding to speak and mute their microphones after they are done speaking. We have ASL interpreters on screen, and live card captioning is available by turning on subtitles using the CC icon on the lower part of the screen. The host will make sure that a spotlight is on all presenters and interpreters. To view both the presenter and the interpreter, along with any presentation materials, please make sure that the gallery view is selected on your personal device. With that said, we are so glad that you are joining us for today's ADA virtual commemoration. As you may know, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act, also known as the ADA, into law on July 26, 1990. Therefore, July 2024 marks the 34-year anniversary of the law's passing. In honoring this historic occasion, we have planned 4 dynamic sessions with a host of awesome presenters who are going to speak to us about the ADA, its protections, and the resources that are currently available. During today's program, we're going to start by taking a look back at the history of the ADA in an informative session presented by Robin Jones of the Great Lakes ADA Center. Next, we will have an overview on assistance animals through a moderated discussion featuring MDCR staff. Then, we will talk about the importance of digital accessibility in a presentation brought to us by representatives from 2 of Michigan's largest universities, U of M and MSU. And finally, we will close out the program by examining the impact of the ADA in a panel discussion featuring representatives from the U.S. Department of Justice, the National Federation of the Blind, and Girls Chronically Rock. Please keep in mind that each session will be no more than 40 minutes, and we will have a quick break between each one. Due to the brief nature of these sessions, all questions will be captured using the Q&A function, and we will provide responses sometime after the close of the program. So now I would like to turn the floor over to our first presenter. Please join me in welcoming Robin Jones of the Great Lakes ADA Center, who is going to talk to us about the history of the ADA. Robin, the floor is now yours.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody, and it's great. Oops, my video didn't go on. There we go. Welcome, everybody, and it's great to see you today in celebration as we mark the month of Disability Pride Month, which all of us are anxious to enter every year and celebrate the passage of the ADA and the implementation of the ADA. Next slide, please. So I'm going to approach this a little bit differently than what you might think I would be, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the last 5 or 6 years before the passage of the ADA. I'm actually going to go back a little bit farther and talk really about the history of what brought us up to the ADA in regards to disability rights in general. So next slide. So this is a quote from David McCall of Brave Companions in Portraits in History. It says, "How can we know who we are and where we are going if we don't know anything about where we have come from and what we have been through, the courage shown, the cost paid to be where we are?" Next slide.
Excuse me, Robin, this
Yes.
is Tim speaking. We are getting comments in the Q&A function that they cannot hear you. I am able to hear you, so I am not sure what is happening. So
Yeah. I've checked my microphone shows that it's working fine. I just did a test on it.
okay, so I'm getting
fine.
other comments now that other participants can hear. So it may be a personal issue. If you
Yeah.
are one of the participants who cannot hear, please perhaps check your volume on your personal device.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start with just talk about the disability rights timeline. And you might think, oh, this would be something I would start in the 50s or something of that nature. But actually, I'm going to start back in the early 1900s. So we look back at the Smith-Hughes Vocational Education Act. If you think about timing of when things were going on at this point, in the early 1900s, you're going to see and think about, we had World War I, we had different things going on. So we saw some vocational acts, one in 1917 and one in 1920, both dealing with providing supports to individuals, primarily focused on individuals who had been in the war, who were going to be receiving or need to receive vocational rehabilitation services. We then saw Franklin Delano Roosevelt being the first president with an obvious disability, even though he hid his disability in most situations. Most people did not know that he had a disability because we didn't have social media then. We had press was minimal at best in regards to pictures, and most things could be staged. And so if you look back and you look at pictures historically of President Roosevelt, you'll see that he always had somebody standing near him. And that was typically because they were helping him to stand. He had polio and he had difficulty being able to stand. He used a wheelchair primarily for his mobility, but you rarely ever saw that depicted in any photos or anything, because that was seen at that time to be viewed as a weakness. If if we had social media and things of that nature then that we have now, it's interesting to see whether or not his disability would have played into whether or not he would have been elected as president. In 1935, we saw the League of the Physically Handicapped formed, which is one of our first organizations that specifically looked at the interests of persons with disabilities. In 1938 was the Fair Labor Standards Act, which was where it also implemented legislation that looked at people with disabilities being paid less than sub-minimum wage for their work. In 1940, we had the American Federation of the Physically Handicapped formed. So again, you start to see a trend here of organizations representing specifically people with disabilities, which looks at 1946 with the National Mental Health Foundation. And then 1951 was when we had Camp Gen Ed. This is famous, and some of you may not. Again, if you think about, you haven't studied disability history, some of you may be familiar with the video that is on Netflix, which is Crip Camp, which is on Netflix. That is a documentary that chronicles what took place at Camp Gen Ed, which was a camp for kids with disabilities. And it's actually where some of our key leadership, such as Judy Heumann and such, really start to get their leadership and their advocacy skills was at Camp Gen Ed. Some of the very first disability rights, disability advocacy happened in that camp. If you're not and have never seen Crip Camp, I would really strongly recommend you look at Netflix and view that particular film. Next, please. Moving forward on the disability rights timeline, we had the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Many people don't realize the fact that the ADA was actually, the disability was actually considered as part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. If you were to go back and read some of the legislative history and the congressional record, you would see where there were many, many different testimonies given as it relates to people with disabilities to be included in the Civil Rights Act. The problem was it was largely a siloed situation in that you did not have a unified voice of people with disabilities. You had different organizations that came forward representing people who are blind, representing people who are deaf, people with cerebral palsy, people with spinal cord injuries, et cetera, speaking about their rights and their needs to be included, but it was not a unified voice. And so Congress really, Congress really didn't know what to do with it. And so they let it go at that point. In 1972, we had the famous decision of Mills versus DC Board of Education and Park v. Pennsylvania, which were key legislative decisions, court decisions that made a huge impact on people with disabilities, which led into the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Now, if I go back all the way to that Gen Ed, Camp Gen Ed, which I talked about in the 50s, the really foundation for what happened with the Rehabilitation Act of 73 started there with that camp. That group of people were some of the same people who led and spearheaded the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. In 1975, we saw the passage of the legislation Education for All Handicapped Children, which is now known as IDEA, Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. That was passed in 1975, giving free, appropriate public education to children with disabilities. In 1978 was our first real major public civil disobedience with people with disabilities, with ADAPT taking on the issue of the fact that the federal government, given the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, was providing significant federal funds to transportation systems across the country, whether they be in Chicago, they be in New York, they be in Philadelphia, wherever else that might be. This led to ADAPT taking on the bus industry, the public transportation industry, and forcing their hand at the fact that with federal dollars, they could not discriminate against people with disabilities. This was a very powerful time in history, and it was really the first time that people with disabilities flexed their muscle, as I would say, in regards to looking at using civil disobedience as a way to enforce or to draw attention to their rights. In 1986, we saw the passage of the Air Carrier Access Act, which covers the airlines in regards to their flights, in regards to the services that they provide, being able to board a plane, being able to get your ticketed seat, being able to have oxygen, being able to travel with a service animal, being able to have your wheeled mobility device or other device carried on the plane with you, et cetera. All of those things fall under the Air Carrier Access Act, not the ADA. When I'm dealing with an airline, I'm dealing with the Air Carrier Access Act. Then just looking at other impacts in the disability rights movement, I. King Jordan became the first deaf president of Gallaudet University in 1988. Some of you, if you were around at that time, may remember the uprising and the protests and the sit-ins that happened at Gallaudet when they were replacing their president and considering not having and hiring somebody who was deaf, that he was the first deaf president to be hired as the president of Gallaudet. And then came along the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which we all are familiar with and which we are focused on today. And then in 1999, one of our most major civil rights Supreme Court decisions in Olmstead versus LC, which guaranteed our right to integration versus segregation. So this is kind of just a timeline to look at some of the major milestones, but I'm going to dive deeper into things a little bit more here as I go. Next slide. So we really have to go way back again. So I've given you that timeline. I'm taking you back again, and I'm talking to you starting with the whole issue of eugenics. Many people don't look at this issue as a disability issue, but it's very much so a disability issue. The eugenics movement was basically looking at the fact that you would perceive anybody who had negative traits, et cetera, as being somebody that you did not want, or that you discouraged reproduction of people who had undesirable traits. That included people with disabilities. In fact, a lot of the focus was on people with disabilities. We know that in other countries, such as we know that there was an interest in Germany and other places to erase people due to their ethnic and other attributes, et cetera. But specifically when we look in the United States and we look to the eugenics movement, it was really about disability and not wanting somebody to carry on or pass on what was deemed to be less than perfect traits as a human being. Next, please. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote in a decision or a statement that when the court ruled that a state statute permitting compulsory sterilization of the unfit, including the intellectually disabled, was for the protection and health of the state, and that it did not violate due process clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States. He said, instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring of crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing of their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this just gives you an idea of where our court sat, where the mindset of America was, and where we were sitting as a country. Next, please. So this is just a question for all of you. Given that we're talking about eugenics being something that's been in the United States since the very beginning, early 1900s, as something that was supported, that states were given the right to be able to pass laws, to have this be legal for somebody to be terminated their life because of this issue. When did forced sterilization of people with disabilities end? You can go ahead, either put it in the chat area or in the Q&A, just to get an idea what people's thoughts are in that area. So I'm getting a lot of different responses here. I'm seeing some responses from 1947, such, lots of different responses. All right. So the answer is, next slide, please. Believe it or not, 1979. That wasn't so long ago when you think about it, right? So up until 1979, states could legally have laws in place that forced sterilization of people with disabilities. So a parent, a guardian, or whatever could say that they wanted their child to be sterilized because they had a disability. This was a very unfortunate situation in our society, for sure. But the good thing is that it did end. The sad thing is that it took that long for it to end. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start talking here in my next few slides about some key people that played a pivotal role in the disability rights movement in the United States. And I'm not talking about just the ADA, I'm talking about disability rights in general. So I'm going to start with Ed Roberts. He contracted polio 2 years before the Salk vaccine came into play. He was a quadriplegic. He used an iron lung. He was not allowed to go to high school and get his diploma because he could not complete PE, which is your physical education, or driver's training. Those were required in order to be able to get your diploma. He was accepted to Berkeley, but then he was denied in Berkeley once they learned that he needed the help of an iron lung to be able to survive. However, he appealed, and with a lot of advocacy from a lot of different levels, he was able to enter and go to Berkeley University. However, the state's VR system, and remember, the VR system was established way back in the early 1900s with the various different VR bills that were there, numerous of them over the years. They refused to provide him funding, and he determined that there was no reasonable expectation for him to be employable. So they did not provide him the funding that other people with disabilities might have gotten to go to school. Next, please. His dormitories at the university at that time, given again, we're talking about a long time ago here, could not accommodate his iron lung. So he lived in the hospital, in the campus hospital. That's where he was relegated to, because that's the only place that they could accommodate his physical disabilities. There were a number of other disabled students who also lived in Comwell, and they formed an organization that was called the Rolling Quads. The Rolling Quads would become the precursor to what is now known as ADAPT. They then became the Physically Disabled Students Association at Berkeley, and they advocated for greater campus and community access. Next, please. He did earn his bachelor's and his master's degree in political science, and he taught at a college in Palo Alto, California. He is considered the father of the independent living movement. He drove the process of independent living and was instrumental in pushing independent living to be part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. He organized students to share services, personal care assistance services and such, in order to be able to survive and continue to go to school. He organized individuals to be able to live independently in the community. He was really the model for what an independent living center would do. Ironically, this last statement shows that in 1976, he became the director of the California Vocational Rehabilitation Agency. Ironically, this is the same agency that refused to fund him to go to college because they said he was unemployable. He then became the director of that agency. There's a lot of irony in that particular situation alone. Next, please. This is a very good video of Ed talking about his life and his experiences. I'm not going to play it in the interest of time today, but when you get the handouts, it will have a clickable link. And I really encourage you to listen to Ed's video and his own story. Next, please. As I mentioned, Ed was very instrumental in the passage of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. It was passed into law, but it was vetoed by Richard Nixon. It became the foundation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It has many different sections that all of us are familiar with or should be familiar with, which includes Section 501, which prohibits employment discrimination based on disability in federal government in hiring. That's why we have a lot of initiatives at the federal level to hire people with disabilities. Section 503, which prohibits discrimination in employment by federal contractors and subcontractors. This is a piece that was recently updated to require a attainment goal of 10% of people with disabilities working for any contractor or subcontractor with the federal government, and it's monitored by the Office of Federal Contract Compliance. And then Section 504, which is the one which most of us are probably familiar with and is often talked about the most, which is the one that prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability by programs that receive federal funds, including the federal government itself. So federal agencies are subject to Federal 504 in regard to their non-discrimination on the basis of disability, but also anyone who receives federal funds, such as a local government, a library, a university, whoever it is that receives those funds cannot discriminate on the basis of disability. Next, please. So basic three tenets of the 73 amendments are: one, in 1978, there was added the Centers for Independent Living. In 1986, it was amended to add supported employment. And in 1992, the Rehab Act was amended to add employment as the primary goal of vocational rehabilitation. So it's a law that is very much living and alive and has been amended over time. With the Centers for Independent Living being established in 1978 as part of the Rehabilitation Act, this was a significant move forward for every state to receive funding for Centers for Independent Living in identified areas of need. And so that's why we see over the whole 50 states plus territories, hundreds of independent living centers in our communities. Next, please. I'm next going to shift to Mark Gold, a name that many people may or may not have heard of, but he has been instrumental in moving forward the concept of special education in the United States. He was a special education teacher in the late 60s. He believed his students had potential that was hidden because of their disability, and he felt that anyone can learn if we figure just exactly how to teach them. Next, please. He said we needed to do it just a different way. He went to the University of Illinois, Chicago, and he devised what was called a systematic instruction method to teach people the most significant impact of disability to perform complex tasks. And his training method was try another way. Next, please. He was instrumental in moving the service system from custodial care to instrumental model of service. He had a belief that people with significant disabilities should have dignity and control of their lives. Next, please. I'm going to move on to Roland Johnson. At age 12, he was sent to Pennhurst State School. This is a name that many of you should be familiar with if you've read anything about disability history. It was a hospital and school near Philadelphia. He spent 13 years there enduring neglect, beatings, racism, and sexual assault. He was a significant force in the closing down of Pennhurst in 1987, which was a major, major move in the United States and a recognition of the fact that institutionalization was not a preferred method for people with disabilities or a correct method for people with disabilities to have dignity in their lives. Next, please. He was awarded, he became a self-advocate. He advocated for liberation. He was a nationally known speaker talking about the rights of institutionalized persons. And unfortunately, he died in a house fire in 1948. Next, please. Fannie Lou Hamer was a leader in the civil rights movement of the 60s and the 70s. She had polio from the age 6. She worked as a sharecropper in the cotton fields of plantations in Mississippi. She was fired after she tried to register to vote. Next, please. She founded the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to challenge the all-white Mississippi delegation in the 1964 Democratic Convention. She accepted the Nobel Peace Prize from Dr. Martin Luther King, and who first personally thanked her for her discipline, wise restraint, and majestic courage. Next, please. She was sterilized under Mississippi's sterilization law without her consent. And in 1963, she was unjustly arrested and beaten to near death in Winona, Mississippi, the jail suffering from kidney damage and partial blindness. Her tombstone reads, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." She was one of the very first leaders in the disability rights movement and also the civil rights movement for Black Americans as well. She was instrumental. Again, it's where we cross over and look at the fact that disability is not unique. Disability crosses across all of our various socioeconomic, racial, ethnic, gender, etc. Next, please. Moving to more contemporary times, we look at Judy Heumann, which is a name that most of us have probably heard about. She is one of the greatest champions of disability rights. She helped draft IDEA as a teacher special ed teacher in 1974. She was the deputy director of the independent living movement. Her and Ed Roberts led the movement together. She was a little bit younger than Ed, but they were instrumental in leading that disability rights movement, starting out in California and moving it forward. And she founded the World Institute on Disability with Ed Roberts, which still exists today in California. Next, please. This is another great video of Judy talking about her life and its impact on the disability rights movement and what the disability rights movement had as an impact on her and her life. Again, I would encourage you when you get your handouts to be able to click on that and view that video, give you a little bit more information. Next, please. Judy was instrumental in orchestrating, so many of you may not be aware of, in that when the Rehab Act was signed in 1973, the Secretary of Health and Education and Welfare refused to sign Section 504 of the Rehab Act. So while the law was signed, there were certain sections of it that were left out and were not signed. There were a lot of different excuses that were given for this, cost being one of them, not fully understanding what the implications for business, government, et cetera, would be was another. Similar arguments that we heard when the ADA came around in 1990. But from 1973 to 1977, there was no movement. There was a lot of effort. There were a number of different hearings that were held. There were a number of different activities that were trying to force. President Nixon was not supportive of it as well. So we just were not able to get it moved forward. So the disability rights movement, again, looking at what had happened in the 1960s, what was necessary, and what had happened in other areas in regards to use of the civil disobedience. They did a 28-day sit-in, 28 days. Just think about that. At Health and Human Health, Welfare, Education and Welfare offices in San Francisco in April of 1977. Over 150 disability rights activists took over that building, the fourth floor of that building, and basically lived there for 28 days. Next, please. If you want to learn more about the sit-in and more about the impact of the sit-in, this is another great video that goes through it and talks about this video. This sit-in was heavily covered by the US press at the time. I would really advise that you take some time and watch the sit-in video. Next, please. Next comes somebody that many people have never heard about, but it was instrumental in the Section 504 sit-in in California. This is Brad Lomax. He himself had multiple sclerosis, but he was a leader in the Black empowerment and disability rights movement. He was also a member of the Black Panthers and the founder of the East Oakland Center for Independent Living. He was one of the protesters in the 504 occupation. Through his connections and through his relationships, he arranged for the Black Panthers to provide 1 meal per day for the protesters. Now remember, this was over 20 days that this group lived in the HEW building. That means that they had to shower, they had to eat, they had to take care of their medical needs, they had to take medications. Many of them had different kinds of treatments that they needed, et cetera. All of this was brought into them by different groups, advocacy groups and such across the country who came and rallied behind this group of individuals to support them in their sit-in. And the Black Panthers are seen as one of the most instrumental in that process. And again, largely due to the advocacy of Brad Lomax, a quiet person on the scene, somebody that we're not often talk about, people don't think about, but somebody who played a key role in the success of that 504 occupation. Next, please. Now to more contemporary times, when we look at the ADA itself and the passage of the ADA, we have Senator Tom Harkin, who is the author of the ADA. Many people now, Senator Harkin still is alive and he's retired from the Congress, but he's still very active. He has the Tom Harkin Institute, which continues to advocate for employment on the behalf of people with disabilities in the US as well as internationally. He refers to the ADA as the Emancipation Proclamation for people with disabilities. One of his quotes is, "Disabled individuals spend a lifetime overcoming not what God wrought, but what man has imposed by custom and law." Many people don't know that Tom Harkin came from a family where his parents were deaf. So he learned sign language at a very young age and grew up in a family where he often had to intercede on behalf of his parents because they were both deaf. He had a long history in his service to this country of promoting rights and services for people with disabilities. Next, please. Justin Dart, the father of the ADA. Many people don't know a lot about his background or such, but he was the president of Tupperware in Japan, and he hired women and people with disabilities to do that. His family was the mega family of Tupperware. The Dart family was the Tupperware family. He moved and went to Japan, and along with his wife, they ran Tupperware in Japan. Another little fact that brings him close to me here in Chicago, he also was a grandchild of the Walgreens family who founded the Walgreens drugstores as we know that. So he has a long history in society and in philanthropy, et cetera. Some executives of the US once told Dart to stop promoting women to executive permissions and to stop his disability campaign. He was a staunch Republican from Texas. However, He did not necessarily fall in along the lines of what the Republican Party or other politicians thought about people with disabilities and issues related to disability rights. He fought against that. He advocated, he used his position of power, he used his position of influence, etc. He was appointed by President Reagan to serve as the chairperson of the President's Committee on Persons with Disabilities, and he held many, many other different positions on different committees and things of that nature. But probably one of the most significant things that he did was he mobilized people. He made people think. He made people believe in the fact that we could have a civil rights law, that it was possible, irregardless of all of the naysayers that were out there. Next, please. One of the most famous things that he did was that he did a tour of the United States, stopping in every state to collect stories of people with disabilities, because he believed that it was the stories that were the power behind people with disabilities. It was the stories that were going to change the mind of Congress. The Congress really didn't understand what the lives of people with disabilities were actually about. And so he and his wife, they went about on their own expense and traveled to every single state. He then brought those stories to Washington and began working towards legislation that is now known as the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those stories were the instrumental piece that really swayed or persuaded Congress to move forward with the ADA. He then was instrumental in persuading, and it was his tour from 1981 that then got replicated in later years after the ADA was passed, as we started to face challenges to the ADA, such as in 2005 when we had the Torch Tour, and then for the anniversary of the ADA in 2025 when we had the ADA bus tour. And this year, again in the fashion of what we have done in the past, we have the Disability and Rights and Justice Caravan that is going around the United States right now, again in similar fashion, to collect stories, to continue to keep in the mind of people that people with disabilities, even with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, still face discrimination every day, and that we're not done just because of the passage of the ADA. Next, please. One of the most instrumental things that also happened as we led up to the passage of the ADA was in March 12th of 1990, over 1,000 people marched from the White House to the US Capitol because the ADA had stalled in Congress. Things were moving along. We had President Bush, who had promised when he was elected in 1988 that he would see forward the passage of a civil rights law for people with disabilities. But of course, we know that a president can't do it by himself. He needs Congress. And there had been many, many hearings. There had been many, many drafts of the law. There had been many, many amendments to the law, but things had just stalled. We were going nowhere and nowhere fast. And so once again, people with disabilities mobilized, and they went and took to the Capitol. Now, think about it at that time. The US Capitol was not accessible. You could not get into the US Capitol because there was no access. There were no elevators or anything of that nature. So they marched and they crawled up, 60 of that 1,000 people crawled up the Capitol steps. They got out of their wheelchairs. They put down their crutches and their canes and their walkers, etc., and walked up it. They did this primarily to demonstrate how inaccessible architecture impacts people with disabilities, and used one of the most iconic buildings in the United States as an example of that. This alone was one of the pivotal moments that moved Congress, because it got a huge amount of public attention, it got a huge amount of press, etc., and Congress really had no choice but to move forward and do something. And that's where we then saw from March 12th of 1990 to when the passage of the ADA and the signing of the ADA took place on July 26th. Next, please. There's a really good video that talks about the Capitol crawl from the perspective of a young 12-year-old woman who was part of that, who had cerebral palsy, who was part of that crawl, and give some of her reflection now, years later, on what that meant to her to do that so many years ago. And again, this particular video is part of your the handouts, and I really encourage you to look at all of the videos that I've included in my handouts for you to get more of a vision of some of the things that I've talked about in the mouths and the words of the people who actually lived these things during that time. It's easy for us to talk about the history, et cetera. It's another thing to really learn from those that actually lived the history of it. Next. That came to the culmination of the passage of the ADA, where we saw Justin Dart sitting on the lawn of the Capitol saying that the ADA is the Civil Rights Act of the future. It is the first time that people with disabilities had full access to laws. Again, remembering that Section 504 gave non-discrimination protections to people who, or entities that received federal funds, but that did not touch your local restaurant or your local hotel or your barber shop or your dry cleaning shop or anything of that nature. And probably one of the most famous lines that was said during the signing of the ADA was, "Let the shameful wall of exclusion finally come tumbling down," by President Bush during the signing of the ADA. So, you know, the ADA was witnessed by Evan Kemp, who was at that time the commissioner of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, and Justin Dart, who again is seen as the father of the ADA on the White House lawn. I was fortunate enough to be there that day. It was a very impactful moment on my life. It was an impactful moment on the lives of everyone with a disability in the United States, whether you were there personally or whether you watched it on TV. Next, please. There's also a very good video of the signing of the ADA and the speeches that were given as it relates to that. I really encourage you again to review and look at that video. It talks about the ADA as being the civil rights law for people with disabilities of the future, but also talks about the fact things of one of the most other famous quotes from President Bush is that while we can legislate what a building looks like, we cannot legislate attitude. Attitude has to come from within. Attitude has to come from change of the individuals and the persons, and that is much harder to do, and something that will take generations to be able to change. And while I look back at the 34 years since the passage of the ADA, I can say I've definitely seen significant progress. I can see that we have made strides that I never thought were possible back in 1990 when I looked forward. But I also see that we have a lot more that needs to be done. We still have a unacceptable employment rate of people with disabilities. We still have an infrastructure that continues to lag behind in full accessibility. We still have a lot of bigotry and a lot of discrimination that occurs when people with disabilities are trying to get jobs, or when people with disabilities are trying to get equal opportunity to be appointed to commissions or to be on councils or to be considered to be equal or equivalent to their counterparts in anything in society. So we have more work to do, but we need to celebrate where we've come. And I'm glad that everybody was here today to be able to help us celebrate the start of Disability Pride Month. And I hope that your month will bring to you a lot more opportunities to celebrate and to move forward and to bring forward the message of hope and promise of what we saw and knew was the possibilities back in 1990 and are still seeing to fruition today. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure talking to you. Next slide just gives you my contact information at the Great Lakes ADA Center. Feel free to contact us at any time if you have questions related to the ADA. We're more than happy to help you, and we're open Monday through Friday from 8:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. Central Time. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the session.
This is Tiara speaking. Thank you so much for sharing, Robin. Your presentation was very informative, and it really set the stage for the rest of our program today. There's really, so much that we can take away from what you shared. But one idea I hope that people walk away with is to try another way. As public servants, business owners, educators, employers, policymakers, we should always strive for accessibility and inclusion in everything that we do. We are now going to have a brief break until 9:50 a.m. when we resume with a discussion on assistance animals. Please feel free to stay logged in and we will see you back at 9:50. Again, if you had any questions for Robin or our staff, you can feel free to put them in the Q&A function and we will be sure to respond to those either in real time or at the close of the program. Thank you again, and we'll see you back at 9:50 for a session on assistance animals. Thank you.